topic when it comes to physics practical is graph and graph plotting. So today we'll be looking at how to plot a standard graph. We'll be looking at how to plot a standard graph. We'll be looking at deductions of laws, and also be looking at some important calculation in graph plotting. So today we'll start from the definition of a graph. Now, what is a graph? A graph is a pictorial representation of a set of data. A graph is a pictorial representation of a set of data. It means that a graph shows a relationship between two variables. A graph shows a relationship between two variables. Now, having known the definition of a graph, let's proceed to deduction of laws. Deduction of laws. Now, what is deduction? When we hear of this word, deduction of a law, what does it mean? Deduction of a law. Deduction of a law is the reduction. Deduction of a law is the reduction. The major important word there is reduction. Now, deduction of a law is the reduction of a simple law or a logarithmic law to the form y is equal to mx plus c. That is called deduction of a law. Deduction of a law is the reduction of a simple law or a logarithmic law to the form y is equal to mx plus c. Let's look at examples of laws. There are two types of laws when it comes to physics practical and graph plotting. The first law, there are two types of laws. There are two types of laws in physics practical. There are two types of laws when we look at physics practical. The first type of law is called the simple law. The first type of law is called the simple law, and the second type of law is called the logarithmic law. The second type of law is called the logarithmic law. Now we'll take each of them, each of these laws, the simple law and the logarithmic law, and we'll know how to deduce these laws. Now, what is a simple law? When you hear of simple law, this word, simple law. A simple law is a law that shows a relationship between x and y. A simple law is a law that shows a relationship between x and y. Now, example of a simple law, an example of a simple law is t is equal to 2 pi square root of L over G. This is an example of a simple law. When we look at simple law, we are looking at a simple relationship between x and y. When we talk about simple law and deduction of simple laws, see, deduction of a law is based on what you are asked to plot in a graph. Remember I said deduction of a law is dependent on what you are asked to plot in a graph. Look at this law. I have that t period is equal to 2 pi times the square root of L over G. This L is the distance. This G is a constant. 2 pi is 1 revolution and t is the period. If I'm asked to plot a graph, of t squared against, against L. If I'm asked to plot a graph of t squared against L, and I'm given this law that t is equal to 2 pi square root of L over G, and I'm asked to plot a graph of t squared against L, your aim is to make t squared subject of formula. Now, the first thing to do, since I have a square root sign, I would remove this square root sign by square root of both sides. Since I have a square root sign, I'm going to square both sides. I'm going to square both sides. If I square both sides, I have that t squared is equal to 2 pi all squared times the square root of L over G all squared. I squared both sides, the left and the right hand side. Now, after squaring both sides, you have this. this square will take off this square root sign. So you have that t squared is equal to 2 pi r squared is the same thing as 2 squared times pi squared times L all over G. At this point, 2 squared is equal to 4. 2 squared is equal to 4. And you have pi squared times L all over what? G. So it means that the deduced form of this law, is t squared is equal to 4 pi times L all over G. This is looking like y is equal to mx, where t squared is plotted on the y-axis and L is plotted on the x-axis. This law has been deduced. This law has been deduced to this. This is what we mean by deduction of a law. Deduction of a law is the reduction of a simple law to the form of y is equal to m. Example 2. I am asked to plot a graph of t squared against n. I'm asked to plot a graph of t squared against n, and I'm given a law that t means period, is equal to 2 pi. 2 pi is equal to 1 revolution times the square root of m. M represents the mass of the pendulum ball over g. G is acceleration due to gravity. I'm given this law and I'm asked to plot a graph of t squared against n. Now, how do you know a simple law? Remember we said we have two types of laws, which is called simple law and the second is the logarithmic law. And how you identify a simple law is the presence of a square root sign. Any law where you see a square root sign is called a simple law. Any law where you see a square root sign is called a simple law. And since I'm asked to plot a graph of t squared against n, it means I'm asked to make t squared subject of the formula. I'm asked to make t squared subject of the formula. So the first thing to do in this law is to cancel out this square root sign. And how do you cancel out this square root sign? Is by squaring both sides. You square both sides. You square both the left and the right hand side. So we start. The first thing to do to remove this square root sign is to square both sides. Now if you square both sides, you have that t squared is equal to 2 pi all squared times the square root of m times the square root of m over g all squared. You have squared both the left hand side and the right hand side. After squaring both sides, this square will take off this square root sign, so that you have that t squared is equal to 2 pi all squared, means 2 squared times pi squared. 2 squared times pi squared is 2 pi all squared, all over g times n, because this square has cancelled out this square root sign. Now at this point, 2 squared is the same thing as 4. So you have that t squared is equal to 4 times pi squared all over g times n. If you look at this law, this is looking like t squared is equal to 4 pi squared times n all over g. This is looking like y is equal to mx. It means you plot mass on the x-axis, you plot t squared on the y-axis, and the slope m means slope, and the slope m, it means the slope m is equal to 4 pi squared over g. The slope m is equal to 4 pi squared over g. This is what we mean by deduction of a law. Deduction of a law is the reduction. This law has been reduced to this. Deduction of a law is the reduction of a simple law or a logarithmic law to the form y is equal to mx. Y is equal to mx is telling us that t squared, the period of square is plotted on the y-axis and m is plotted on the x-axis. So if you have a graph of x against y, it means that what will be plotted on the y-axis is t squared and what will be plotted on the x-axis is m, while this is your origin. It means you have a linear graph with a slope, and here is change in t squared, while here is change in n. This is what is meant by deduction of a law. So we'll take another example on logarithmic law.